Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about what not to do if you think you have discovered a false claim against the government. So let's discuss that down at the beach. Now, there's a very powerful statute that many people know about, and many people don't know about, called the Federal False Claims Act. Sometimes it's called the Lincoln Law because it was passed at the behest of President Lincoln right after the Civil War to recover money that was spent by, or that was stolen really, by war profiteers. Basically, people who, when the government came and requisitioned 10 horses, would write another zero behind the 10 horses and get paid by the government for 100. So the False Claims Act was set up to essentially incentivize the public to report that kind of fraud. And it provided a mechanism whereby if you did report fraud, you got a reward. Well, the statute served the country very well right up until World War II, and then it was thought to be a bit of an impediment to the war effort because it was punishing contractors who, oddly enough, were stealing from the government. So they made a few changes to the statute and it lay dormant until 1986. And then in 1986, Senator Grassley and several other people in Congress got together and they revitalized the act. Since then, it's been changed several times, most recently in concert with the PPACA, the what is traditionally called Obamacare. And even after that, other changes in other statutes have limited its effectiveness. And as of today, it's not nearly as effective as it was when it came out in 1986, but it still can be effective if people know how to do the right thing. This is the actual text of the statute. It says that liability ensues for someone who knowingly presents or causes to be presented a false or fraudulent claim for payment or approval, knowingly makes, uses, or causes to be made or used a false record or statement material to a false or fraudulent claim, or C, conspires to commit a violation of subparagraph A, B, D, E, F, or G. So those are the three principal elements. The other one that comes up quite frequently is paragraph G. Someone who knowingly makes, uses, or causes to be made or used a false record or statement material to an obligation to pay or transmit money or property to the government, or knowingly conceals or knowingly and improperly avoids or decreases an obligation to pay or transmit money or property to the government. Now, if you violate this act, you're liable for a civil penalty of not less than $5,000 nor more than $10,000, plus 3 times the amount of the damages which the government sustains because of the fraudulent act. Now, the statute provides for the federal government to bring one of these actions, but it also provides that a private citizen can bring an action in the name of the government, and that they have to serve a copy of the complaint and a disclosure of all the substantial material evidence. The requirement of an evidentiary disclosure is to allow the government to review the material and decide whether they should take the case forward, or whether, if they're not interested in taking the case forward, they should let the relator, the person who brings this information to them, take the case forward. So that is how these cases get filed, and that's how they get in front of the courts and in front of the Department of Justice. If you suspect any kind of fraud on the government at all, go see a lawyer who handles False Claims Act cases. Now, your average slip and fall attorney, not the right guy. Your average contract attorney, not the right guy. The guy who wrote your will, not the right guy. You need somebody who actually understands the False Claims Act, who's filed cases under the Act, who's litigated some of those cases under the Act, and who understands not only how you can be successful, but perhaps most importantly, how you can fail. The Act provides for several different types of false claims. The false claim where the claim is simply false. In other words, there is no, you charge Medicare for a surgery for John Doe, and you submit his Social Security number and Medicare number and all that stuff that you have stolen out of some other doctor's trash can. That's a false claim. And irrespective of whatever else is false in it, that claim is false because no surgery happened. Then there is the false record in support of a false claim, where the situation is you create an entire medical record to buttress your claim that you took a bunion off John Doe's toe. Complete fiction. That false record is a separate false claim, or in other words, a separate violation of the False Claims Act. And then there is the conspiracy angle, where you get together with perhaps the trash hauler for Dr. Jones down the road and say, hey, if you will pull out anything that has a Medicare number on it, I will bill that Medicare number and we'll make tons of money. So the trash hauler and the false biller get together. That's called a conspiracy to violate the False Claims Act, and that is also a violation and independently actionable. And then finally, although there are other ways you can violate the False Claims Act, there is something called a reverse false claim. And a reverse false claim occurs when someone knows that they have been overpaid for something. For example, due to a clerical error in the Department of the Army, let's say, Lockheed gets paid for 5 tanks when it's only supposed to get paid for 1. They know they've been overpaid, but they don't refund the payment. That is a reverse false claim, where you ignore or decrease or avoid an obligation to repay the government. All of those things are false claims, and there are a number of different cases out there that discuss this. There's a great website called Taxpayers Against Fraud. You can learn everything you need to know about the False Claims Act on that website. And in addition to that, you can get a referral to a number of lawyers who work in this area. And there are lawyers all across the country who work in this area. Now, a lot of times people learn about this statute and they immediately become Inspector Clouseau, and they start digging around trying to find evidence of false claims. And that is the point where you can really run afoul of the statute. I'll give you a really good example. Let's suppose you know that Dr. X is violating a provision of some Medicare regulation. Let's say he's a radiologist and he is overbilling for radiographic examinations. But you don't have any evidence really of him doing that, except you're pretty sure that he did it on your bill. But because you are not a Medicare beneficiary, you don't know for sure that he's doing it on Medicare patients. So you have to figure that out with respect to the Medicare beneficiaries. One way you might think about doing that is to file a Freedom of Information Act request. But you absolutely should not do that. And let me explain why. Under the statute, there is a bar as to people who obtain information from a government report. Let's look at that section right now. The statute says the court shall dismiss an action, in other words, it must, or claim under this section unless opposed by the government if substantially the same allegation or transactions as alleged in the action or claim were publicly disclosed in a federal criminal, civil, or administrative hearing in which the government or its agent is a party, in a congressional government accountability office or other federal report, hearing, audit, or investigation, or 3, from the news media, unless the action is brought by the Attorney General or the person bringing the action is an original source of the information. So the public disclosure bar essentially prevents anybody who finds out about fraud from a federal report from receiving a reward about it. Now, it doesn't matter that you suspected fraud, you went and got this government report, you put two and two together and figured out that there was a false claim here. That doesn't matter because the courts, particularly in the Eighth Circuit and several of the other circuits, just hate this statute. I don't know why they hate the statute. They ought to be really glad we have it because it ought to be something that is a way to recover money that people have stolen from the government. But for whatever reason, either because they don't understand it particularly well, some of the judges, or perhaps because they have a bias against people going after corporations. I don't know which of the two it is, but they really don't like it. And they tend to very, very strictly construe it in ways really that the congressional intent is not there supporting it. That is something, and I think if you've ever watched any of the hearings in front of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Grassley is always asking anybody who is nominated to the federal bench what their views are on the False Claims Act. And for that reason, he has managed to keep people who are not particularly attuned to protecting the government fisc off of courts. But be that as it may, there are minefields in this statute that if you run afoul of them, you're not going to be able to pursue your claim. And one of them is this government report thing. Now, you have to even be careful about that because even though it says that it has to be in a federal report or investigation, if a state agency is a deferral organization, in other words, if the state health department conducts some kind of surveys and they do it pursuant to federal statute as a deferral agency, meaning that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services defers to that state agency to do its inspection, for example, then the report can be characterized in some instances as a federal report. And so for that reason, you have to be really careful about where you get information. Now, there are other ways to get information that don't violate this particular area, but you have to be careful, for example, about news media reports. Let's say you hear on the news media that Pratt Whitney produced some defective airplane engines, and you go to file a lawsuit against them under the False Claims Act because of that. If you learned about it through the media, you're not going to get anywhere. Now, there is an exception in the statute for an original source, and an original source is defined in the statute like this. For purposes of this paragraph, original source means an individual who either 1. Prior to a public disclosure under subsection E4A has voluntarily disclosed to the government the information on which allegations or transactions in a claim are based, or 2. Who has knowledge that is independent of and materially adds to the publicly disclosed allegations or transactions, and who has voluntarily provided the information to the government before filing an action under this section. And while most False Claims Act attorneys will do that, will provide information to the government before filing under the section, the original source continues to be terribly construed by the courts. And the government often refuses to object to a dismissal under this False Claims Act section, simply because if it doesn't object, the claim goes away and it has nothing to do. Now, if you meet that requirement, then a lot of times your claim will not be barred. We have tried very often to do exactly that, to set somebody up as an original source, but a lot of times courts nitpick that as well. So if you don't have some independent information that you acquired, for example, by working at the company, then you're not going to be in a situation where you will ultimately be successful in getting a reward from the government, even if the government winds up pursuing your claim. Because here's the thing, if the government doesn't pursue your action, your lawyer can pursue the action against the company. He'll meet with a lot of stiff resistance, and a lot of times the cases are dismissed there. If the government decides to pursue it, the government is not subject to the to the bar. It's not subject to the public disclosure bar. And so even though there's a public disclosure, if the case is good enough, the government will take it, run with it, and go get money back for the government. But then when it comes time to pay you your reward, your relator's share, they will look at you with a straight face and say, you didn't add anything. Sorry, you don't get a reward. And I've seen that happen. And it's sad, but it is true. That is exactly what happens. So, what ways can you get information? Well, you can talk to employees, but you have to be careful even with that. It's better if you work in a company that's cheating the government because you tend to be an original source at that point because you work there and you saw it with your own two eyes. But if you didn't work there and you just heard from somebody who did work there, then it becomes a hearsay statement and you're not the original source. The person who told you is the original source, and if they're not on the complaint, then again, the case is going to wind up being dismissed, or if the government takes it forward, you're going to wind up not getting a share of the spoils when the government recovers money. So again, this is why it is so important to go seek out a lawyer who understands this system and the statute so that they can advise you about how to go about getting information. There are little pin cameras that you can put in your pocket. Brookstone sells them. And you can use those to record conversations unless that is prohibited by state statute. And again, you're going to need a lawyer to tell you whether you can do that. If you can't do that, you can copy documents. You can go through the trash. Well, let's suppose that, the doctor's office that you know is false billing is dumping its trash out in the dumpster, and you can go crawl into that dumpster at 8, 9 o'clock at night with a flashlight and go through the dumpster and look to determine, if there's anything in that trash that supports a false claim. That's completely legitimate. What you can't do is you can't file a Freedom of Information Act request. You can't go to a state deferral agency and use their reports. And for the most part, you can't rely on information from somebody who works in an organization unless they are willing to join you in being a relator. That's the name of the person who files the claim. Unless they're willing to join you on the case, it's really not going to help. So, what to do? One, if you suspect this, go see an attorney who handles these kinds of cases. Get advice. Find out what you can do. Make sure you know what you cannot do. And only do what you can do. It is better not to get a reward. It's better to have your case thrown out than to do something that's going to get you in criminal jeopardy, like recording when you're not supposed to record, or that winds up costing you money down the road because you get sued, or because if the defendant prevails in the lawsuit that you bring, a lot of times they can get fees against you. So you have to be very, very certain that if you're going to take one of these cases forward, if for any reason the government decides not to advance the case, if for any reason that happens, you have to be really careful because you don't want to wind up paying the legal fees of people who buy lawyers at $500, $700, $900 an hour to defend these things. And that's routinely the case with organizations that are involved in government fraud. They can afford to hire very expensive attorneys, and very expensive attorneys tend to be very creative attorneys. So that's what I have for you today. I wish I had better information, better news, but that's what you can do. That's what you can't do. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. Like, share, subscribe. You know all the things we ask you to do. If you get a chance today, go out of your way to do something nice for someone. Do a kindness. You really will feel better about yourself. You'll feel better about the world in general if you take some time to spread the love. Have a great day, folks, and I'll catch you down here tomorrow at the beach. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.